Hi, I'm Jim Marshall. I'm the president of the United States Institute of Peace. I want to welcome you all here. This is an important panel and an important topic, and we wouldn't be having the panel today, nor the topic, but for Fred Tipson, and I want to recognize Fred and thank Fred for organizing this. Fred is going to be the moderator during the discussion period. I'll give a brief introduction of our guest, Helen Clark. She will then speak maybe for 10 or 15 minutes, and then there'll be a panel discussion. Helen Clark became UNDP Administrator in April 2009. This is generally considered to be the number 3 role in the United Nations after the Secretary General and the Deputy Secretary General. Helen Clark was just confirmed for the 2nd term by the UN General Assembly last week, which begins on Saturday. She is the first woman to lead UNDP and serves simultaneously as chair of the UN Development Group, comprising the heads of all UN funds, programs, and departments working on development issues. In both 2011 and 2012, Forbes magazine ranked her among the world's most powerful women. Prior to her appointment at UNDP, Helen Clark served for 9 years as Prime Minister of New Zealand, serving 3 successive terms from 1999 to 2008. Under her leadership, New Zealand achieved significant economic growth, low levels of unemployment, and high levels of investment in education and health. Helen Clark came to the role of Prime Minister after an extensive parliamentary and ministerial career. First elected to Parliament in 1981, Helen Clark was re-elected to her multicultural Auckland constituency for the 10th time in November 2008. Prior to entering the New Zealand Parliament, Helen Clark taught in the Political Studies Department of the University of Auckland. She graduated with a BA in 1971 and MA with first-class honors in 1974. She is married to Peter Davis, a professor at Auckland University. Let's welcome our guest.
Thank you, Jim. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Fred, for creating the opportunity for me to come and speak at the Institute around these themes of building resilience to conflict, violence, and disasters. I have read the excellent paper which Fred has produced in his time as a fellow here at the Institute. I should say it's a gloomy little paper, but it's one which sets the scene rather nicely for your discussion today, this morning, and during our lunchtime here as well. And I guess what I can comment on is these issues from a practitioner perspective, recognising that an audience like this is always full of experts, and talk about some of the ways in which the UN Development Programme with its partners addresses the nexus of issues. Now, it's timely to be having this conversation because a global conversation is raging around what the International Development Agenda should look like beyond the expiry date for the Millennium Development Goal targets in December 2015. And part of the global conversation has been a specific thematic discussion around conflict, violence, and disaster. And that discussion, which culminated in a very important meeting in Helsinki last month, has concluded, as Fred's paper does, that these areas of conflict, violence, disaster are increasingly intertwined with other challenges, whether they be what's happening to our climate, high unemployment, social polarisation, economic shocks, and more. So building resilience of societies and communities in this very complex environment certainly requires multi-dimensional approaches. It's not one swing of the wheel. The post-2015 conversation is also taking place in a very different development landscape from that when the Millennium Development Goals were launched in the year 2000. And I remember that time, and I remember the Millennium Summit, which I went to as Kiwi Prime Minister at that time. It was actually a rather hopeful time, the start of the new millennium, but unfortunate that the next few years turned out to be rather shocking in many respects, but there was certainly hope in 2000. And of course, there have been positive things this past 13 years or so happening. Just in the last month, UNDP has issued its latest human development report called The Rise of the South, and it's looking at the cluster of countries which have been, if you like, particularly successful, not only in growing their economies and opportunity, but investing back in their people, education, health, social protection, so combining human development and economic development. So that's a positive trend. But on the challenges side, we certainly have these incredible climate challenges, and with what we are experiencing at a global temperature rise of rather less than the 2-degree level, which we were told over and above pre-industrial levels would represent very serious consequences. One shudders to think what a 6-degree rise in temperatures over pre-industrial levels might bring, and 6 degrees is now postulated by credible forecasters as what will happen if we don't endeavour to arrest the trend. Also on the challenges side, these very powerful demographic trends which are producing the largest generation of youth which our world has ever known, many of them without a lot of hope and optimism and opportunity at the moment. And if there's not much bigger commitment to investing in youth and youth potential, then we will face the consequences of that. And then on the challenge side, we see the uprisings, the turmoil as citizens in countries which have had very authoritarian governments rise up and say we want something better. But the tumultuous times to go through to the something better are obviously also not bringing more jobs and opportunity in the short term. In the longer term, we hope they will. So this brings us then to the changing nature of conflict and violence. We see traditional high-intensity interstate and intrastate conflicts among organised parties on sharp decline. But these deadly, smaller-scaled, armed violence in the community, conflicts, this is on the rise, and the impact on development is quite significant. We're rather active on the citizen security issue across Latin America and the Caribbean, where homicide rates are nearly 4 times the global average, with some 23 murders per 100,000 people, and of course far more in some countries. Around the world, we see many examples of links between weak governance and levels of conflict. We see conflict and armed violence destroying people's livelihoods, lives, services and infrastructure, and certainly putting people off making the kinds of investments in their futures which are necessary to build a better future. Among the risk factors for conflict, we note the impact of resource depletion and contamination of natural resources, the climate volatility, and the way these then become intertwined with the displacement of people, migration, urbanisation, unemployment, ethnic and religious tensions, and more. We've seen for decades how inequitable and unsustainable management of lucrative natural resources fuels cycles of violence. And in Africa, we think the risk of further conflict due to transnational trafficking in commodities like gems, minerals and timber will go up unless more robust governance mechanisms for resource management can be built. We see the fast-growing concentrations of people in urban areas which have inadequate infrastructure and low preparation for even predictable natural hazards. It's quite unnerving to do what is called the earthquake walk in Kathmandu and see the underpreparedness for a major seismic event, which on the law of averages will happen. It's a question of when. By the year 2030, most of the world's people living in extreme poverty will be located in places which are affected by chronic violence and political instability. There, the perpetuation of weak institutions and fragile social protection systems not only undermine poverty eradication, but also the ability of countries to anticipate and prevent and prepare for and recover from shocks and crises. And we would expect that people in such places will suffer higher mortality and relative economic losses from disasters compared to countries which have been able to build greater resilience. So, from this somewhat gloomy picture, which Fred's work has prepared you for in this discussion this morning, I want to talk about the messages that we take from it at the UN Development Programme and the need to apply frameworks and tools which take into account multidimensional risks and enable all partners to respond more comprehensively, more efficiently, and on the basis of stronger collaborative approaches than have been the case in the past. Many in the international community, including USAID and UNDP, are promoting resilience building as a coordinated response to linked humanitarian and development challenges. And the aim is to put more emphasis on that prevention and on anticipating risk rather than parking the ambulance at the bottom of the proverbial cliff and waiting for disaster to strike. For us, building resilience is about strengthening the capacities of people and their communities and their institutions to do this anticipation, prevention, and be able to rebound from shocks, disasters, and other crises, including conflict and violence, which fits with the core human development approach of UNDP, which is about supporting the expansion of people's choices and the enhancement of their capabilities and freedoms. We see the concept of resilience as having originated primarily in discourse about disaster risk reduction, but less emphasis has been placed on how this approach could be applied to prevention and mitigation of other shocks, such as political conflict, armed violence, and economic and social crises. But we think that just as you can strengthen riverbanks and build levees to protect against a flood, equally you can strengthen institutions. You can equip communities with the skills to prevent conflict. You can introduce the technology needed to monitor and predict where violence might occur in the hope of minimizing its impact. And you can develop tools which support the mediation and resolution of conflict where it arises. And I should say that all of those things were part of what led to Kenya being able to hold elections which were just a quantum leap from the situation which prevailed after their previous elections, which led to the terrible violence. All these preventive approaches were used. So we take a broader approach to resilience as a means of preventing crisis and as a strategy for promoting sustained human development. Leads us to support the building of stronger institutions and the empowerment of citizens for more resilient communities. And we see resilient communities as characterised by higher levels of trust and cooperation, effective leadership, broad participation, and a culture around prevention and capacity. We think high-functioning social networks, organisations and associations and civil society, predictable source of livelihoods, access to public services. These are also vital characteristics of resilient communities. Obviously, the quality of governance matters a great deal in building resilience. When state institutions can't guarantee access to justice and functioning public services, when they can't respond adequately to shocks and volatility, including natural disasters, where they can't provide an enabling environment where citizens can flourish, you get discontent and tensions and problems. Communities become more vulnerable to criminal or other violent entities which can so quickly fill any void. Our work in governance aims to ensure that institutions are more effective, inclusive, accountable, and responsive to the needs of all, not least the poorest and most vulnerable in communities. We see this as very essential for establishing the trust and confidence which is needed between citizens and their state, and for helping countries make the transition from fragility and to resilience. So let me underline that we see fragility leading to conflict, violence, inability to respond adequately to disaster risk as deriving not just from weak institutions, but also from societies which are understrained. and that community resilience is characterised by tolerance, dialogue, ability to collectively analyse and solve problems, strong networks and connections among individuals. So I thought I'd just conclude my opening comments by talking about some of the work we've been involved in to strengthen both institutions and communities and advance resilience, which enables long-term development to get traction. I'll start with Colombia, where over the past decade and more, we've been supporting local government in conflict-affected regions to work with marginalised groups, such as internally displaced and Indigenous peoples and victims of the conflict. And these local governments, together with the groups, have been engaged in putting together inclusive municipal and governorate plans to respond to the local needs. Groups representing women, peasants, ethnic minorities, victims of the conflict have been creating peace-building platforms. And I went to Colombia a few weeks ago and went up to a region just south of the Caribbean coast and met the mayor and the groups with which he works, so the women's groups, the victims groups, the peasant groups, the displaced groups, victims groups generally. And it was really quite humbling to see what these people of goodwill were creating together out of a very difficult past situation where civil society leaders had themselves been direct targets of violence and even assassination. Complementing that work, at the national level, we also have worked with Colombia's Congress on the victims and land restitution law, which it passed, which is enabling some of the past grievances to be addressed and helping ensure that the legislation was aligned with international standards and that victims groups could really participate in and have input into the consultative process. Go far away from there to northern Uganda, which is also known its troubles, where we've worked with district local government and communities around managing conflict related to natural resource allocation. For example, supporting construction of local dam, which brought together pastoralist communities to work out how together they could manage and share scarce common resources. And a project like this also supports economic empowerment, including of women and young people, through small grants, savings and loan schemes, and so on. Somalia, very tough environment, where violent conflict, criminal groups, natural disasters have taken a devastating toll on people's lives and livelihoods. And the work there, again, has been comprehensive. Supporting the justice and security sector by building courts, improving access to them, training police and judges, establishing legal aid networks, and also around addressing the community's vulnerability to natural hazards and disaster. On reduction of risk to natural hazards, we've worked around the world to strengthen the capacity at the municipal and local government level. We think this is extremely important and have many positive examples which could be cited in that area. So to come to a conclusion, we feel that if we're to live in a world where the very last person living in extreme poverty is to be reached and lifted up, we really have to look at these comprehensive resilience-based approaches across conflict, violence, disaster, looking at multiple risks and threats. And this sentiment is very strongly supported by those who participated in this post-2015 major meeting on conflict, violence and disaster held in Helsinki last month. We know that success in this area is very much about partnerships. So the partnership for us with the US government through the Global Alliance for Drought Resilience and Growth and through the Political Champions Group for Disaster Resilience is extremely important. None of us on our own, working alone, can advance the ambitious agenda which is needed to tackle the kinds of problems that Fred's identified in his paper or that I've identified briefly here today. And I think we really do need to be looking at how we take collaboration between partners and across the humanitarian and development communities to new levels to deal with these multidimensional risks and threats. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. I think we need to get you out of here by 1:15, so we have about 20 minutes. I'll attempt to moderate Q&A, so people, we have microphones on either side that please take advantage of so that we can all be heard. I just, since I work for you for a time but don't have the chance to fire questions at you quite in this manner, let me take the privilege of asking you the first question, which is, coming from the remarks you've made, what resonance, when you talk to donor leaders in particular, both in the MDG, post-MDG conversations about what the goals will be beyond 2015, but also as you go around capitals to donor countries, what resonance are you finding on the whole theme of resilience and building in institutional resistance and strength to these kinds of problems?
I think that many of the traditional donor community have got really stripped out by the need to respond to the complex emergencies, so many of which relate to underdevelopment and not having systems in place that can stop the worst happening. So minds in the donor community have very much been turning to how to support building resilience, and we see the US, European Union, and also UK DFID, in particular, the Development Agency, specifically earmarking a proportion of the humanitarian budget now for resilience building. Japan, another very major donor, and with its own long history of coping with great risk to natural disaster, including not least the Great East Japan earthquake. Japan also very committed to resilience building and supporting other countries to do it. And important to remember that just as we're renewing a global development agenda in 2015, there's also in 2015 a need to renew what's been known as the Hyogo framework for disaster risk reduction. The Hyogo decade comes to an end, so we've got a happy coincidence, if you like, of end of the Millennium Development Goal period with end of the Hyogo decade, and maybe bringing some of the common themes together in the new global agenda.
Well, let me turn to the audience. I think we can start on this side. If you please identify yourselves before you make your...
Hi, my name is Gabriel Toledo. I'm from Georgetown University. And my question is, how can technology has technology helped prevent conflicts such as natural disasters, such as droughts in Africa, for example?
Well, for sure, better forecasting systems and early warning systems will help avert the worst. And I think we can see a good example of that in Niger and West Africa. Niger, as people know, is a very, very poor country. And if we go back to the drought before the last one, there wasn't an early warning system. The government at the time wasn't particularly helpful in telling the world community what was going on. And the response to this very, very severe drought then inevitably came late, and with quite tragic effects. People got completely stripped out, obviously children's development greatly harmed, no doubt lives lost. Now, as a response to that, at the UN, we got rather busy seeing that Niger could be a wonderful place to apply what we call the MDG acceleration framework, to devise an action plan to try and speed up progress on MDG 1, which is around food security and nutrition, reducing hunger. And the interim authority then in Niger embraced this, as did the government, which was eventually elected. Now, the result was that even in a short period of time, quite a lot of work was able to be done on an early warning system. So when within 2 years, the next 1 in 100 year drought struck, and I do start to wonder about 1 in 100 year droughts. I think all these predictions are thrown out now with what's happening with our climate. But when that drought was consequence becoming apparent, Niger was out there very, very early. And I think that had an incredible impact in stopping the worst happening in Niger with that severe drought in 2011-12. So we know that the most basic investments in early warning systems will work, and I think that's a good example of it.
On this side, or in the middle.
Hi, thank you. I'm Patty McElreevy from Interaction. And Interaction, as you know, sits on the Interagency Standing Committee alongside with UNDP, and resilience has been a big topic over the past year. So it's interesting to hear you talk about it and say, we know that resilience is needed. The crises that are coming up are often because of underdevelopment or failures of development. And yet we see that the donors are starting to earmark humanitarian funds towards the resilience agenda. And this is a concern for us as from the humanitarian perspective, because we already are strained in our ability to respond to the complex emergencies, the changing environment, the additional demands on us and how we work. And then to also think that somehow we will be able to take a part in really resolving a resilience agenda, which again has been tried by many and unsucceeded from the development perspective. And if you could talk a little bit more about how do you see that working within the humanitarian community and the development community to where the responsibilities lie for making this go forward without it being and maybe a burden on another community that isn't necessarily prepared or skilled to fill the gap.
In the end, I don't really care what part of a government's overseas official development assistance is allocated for this. What I know is more must be allocated for it. And I gave you a sort of simple example of some of the early work in Niger. But we could also instance the work that's been done in Bangladesh in averting massive numbers of deaths from the big cyclones. It's been very successful. We can instance the work that was supported by development partners in Mozambique to reduce loss of life and livelihood from flooding. So we know this approach works, and I think the donors, seeing the complex emergencies, seeing the rise in world population, many people living in these very exposed areas, they want to get on the front foot. And I applaud them getting on the front foot, because the more we can get on the front foot and achieve with other countries what's been achieved in Bangladesh, in Mozambique, etc., then in the end, the fewer really complex mass emergencies we're going to have to deal with. Imagine if Haiti had well-functioning government and a building code which was enforced. We would not have seen roughly 250,000 people killed in Port-au-Prince. So it's a no-brainer that development assistance really needs to be prioritising this area.
Thank you. Madam Administrator, it's a pleasure to be addressing you. I'd like to draw your attention. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm John McCormick, and I'm with the Institute for Multi-Track Diplomacy. I'd like to direct your attention to Pakistan, certainly a country in conflict, bordering a country at war. But Pakistan has recently released its national climate change policy. And because of Amendment 18 in the Pakistan Constitution, it's now the provinces that are going to have to implement this very complex policy. Just to give you one example, Punjab's $7 billion US budget has a $700,000 Environment Department budget. So virtually no resources available to these provinces. It's going to demand a serious partnership between the UN, the World Bank, US, EU, other countries that will embrace Pakistan's effort to prepare for what is the onslaught of continuing floods, drought, etc. in Pakistan. And I would hope that after the elections and things get sorted out in Pakistan, that it will really embrace the fact that it's now going to start to meet the challenge of preparing for its climate change impacts. Thank you.
Thank you for the comment. When I visited Pakistan a couple of years ago, I became aware that it had embarked on what I'll call a Big Bang devolution, and has pushed out to that provincial level, as you say, responsibility for a very, very wide range of policies. But the capacity needs to be built then to try and implement important policies like that one, and then there's plenty of others as well. And in meeting with the UN country team of agencies, a number of the agencies were expressing concern to me as to the capacity in place or lack of it to deal with a range of very significant issues. So I think for me it reinforces the importance of work not only with federal authorities but down the line with provincial and municipal authorities and communities, because the strengthening needs to come from the bottom up and the top down, and there's a lot of capacity to be built.
Thank you very much. I'm Jean-Baptiste Migren from GFDR, and I think you know quite well this partnership, which involves the UNDP with the World Bank with nearly 40 partners, and we're pleased to have you tomorrow at the Resilience Dialogue. You mentioned that we really need now tools to make sure that disaster risk reduction and conflict prevention is well integrated in the different activities. And I think it's quite a major priority for the international community. For already more than 10 years, we've been telling basically that it's a cross-cutting issue and it has to be addressed through different number of sectors. And I think we still don't have the tracking tools and basically the integration tools necessary to make sure that it becomes the job of every stakeholder and every players to consider in a relevant manner both disaster risk reduction with conflict prevention and with a number of other cross-cutting issues. I think the most well-known is the gender issue, which is very well applied across the sectors. So I'd like to hear from, well, I'm sure you're going to develop tomorrow a little more on that, but in this context of renewing the MDGs and coming with a wider agenda, if you could just tell us from what you've learned at UNDP, you were one of the first agencies to set up these guidelines for mainstreaming disaster risk reduction in the UNDAF and CCR processes in 2009, and I would be glad to learn a bit of how these tools can be applied across.
What I'd say in a general sense is I think we need to sort of move above seeing each of these problems in silos to look at, what are the common approaches which might have an impact across them. And that inevitably brings you back to governance and its capacity. If governance is good, if institutions are strong, if there's an ability to not only write good strategies, but actually put them into place and deliver on them, and then combine that strengthening of governance and institutions with strengthening communities, social cohesion, social safety nets, employment, livelihoods. Tackling these two things actually helps address quite a multitude of problems, from conflict to building disaster resilience to insulation to shock of various kinds. So I think it's bringing this resilience lens or perspective, if you like, across a range of issues, which is important to me.
I'm going to take the opportunity to ask you another question. In my gloomy little paper, one of the things I was most gloomy about was the continuing inability of the various players in the development community and the wider donor community, as well as the engagement with host government, to make more progress on cohesion, collaboration, coordination of efforts. Even though we could always use more resources devoted to working on issues like increasing resilience, the donors and various players seem to compete to too often and contradict each other and undermine each other's agendas. Since you chair the UN Development Group, which tries to bring more cohesion among the UN agencies in particular, what is your sense of how we can make this collaboration more effective? We saw in Haiti, I would say, a suboptimum performance on the part of the international community, despite the generosity of the individual players and the capability of many of them. We still could have done so much better if our teamwork was more effective. What is your sense?
Well, I think it's ironic that tough times fiscally for everyone working in this space should really produce more collaboration and sharing of effort, but it tends to have the opposite effect because everyone's seeking to brand their own efforts as important so that they can mobilise resources around them. As I said in my concluding comment, to tackle problems of the complexity that we're dealing with here, no one can do it on their own. We really have to rely on partnerships being greater than the sum of the parts, as it were. And I can only encourage the agencies, funds and programs of the UN, which I'm in the sort of top chair for coordinating, to combine their efforts. But also at the national level in developing countries, I think donor coordination is extremely important, and it's something we play a role in. I think in about 70 plus countries we co-chair donor coordination mechanisms to try and get everybody on the same page. And then to the greatest extent possible, try to line up with national strategies, because if we try to reinvent and second guess and displace, if you like, the strategies often poor countries are trying to implement themselves, we don't do them a service either. And I think that's a message across the multilaterals, the bilateral agencies, the NGOs. Try and line up with what's happening and get the maximum impact we can.
Well, we're mindful that you're here in Washington in large part to participate in meetings around the World Bank, IMF, spring meetings, some of which are related to disaster resilience coordination with Rajiv Shah and others, I understand. So being mindful of how grateful we are that you took the time out to come over and talk to this audience, we are also mindful that you need to get back to that agenda as well. So let me express my thanks and on behalf of the audience, but hope that we can get you back here on a regular basis to increase the kind of collaboration that I think we look forward to between this institute and yourself.
Thanks, Fred.
We'll take a brief pause and then we'll leave the panel up here.
Good, break over. Good afternoon. I'm Proctor Reed. I direct the policy programs at the National Academy of Engineering, which is collaborating along with our sister academy, the National Academy of Sciences, with the U.S. Institute of Peace on our roundtable initiative on technology, science, and peace building. The roundtable brings together experts from government agencies, international organizations, corporations, academic institutions, and NGOs to identify problems in peace building that we hope we can bring engineering, technology, and science to bear on for greater impact. This panel will address one of those problem areas that demands more attention and policy action, namely the potential political, economic, societal risks and impacts of natural disasters, including the generation of violent conflicts and other threats to national security. The environmental impacts we have in mind include those expected to be generated by the effects of climate volatility, but also those resulting from natural phenomena such as earthquakes and pandemics that could well interact with extreme environmental events to create a toxic political mix. A number of us participated in a small workshop on these issues this morning, and we hope to bring some of those insights to this larger audience. Our three panelists bring a wide range of expertise on these issues. Their full bios, I understand, are available to you on the table outside, so I will not elaborate all the details. I ask your forgiveness in that, please, panelists. John Steinbrenner is Professor of Public Policy at the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland, and he's also Director of the Center for International and Security Studies at Maryland. He was also Director of Foreign Policy Studies at the Brookings Institution prior to that. Sherry Goodman is General Counsel of the Center for Naval Analysis and a participant in the same National Research Center study that John helped chair, and you'll hear a bit more about that. Sherry was Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security during the Clinton administration. Both John and Sherry were involved in an important report that was issued earlier, actually earlier this year, I think the very end of 2012, by our main policy research arm, the National Research Council, on climate and social stress implications for security analysis, which I commend to all of you. Their comments will highlight some of the insights from that study. Fred Tipson is an advisor here at USIP and works with me and his colleagues on the Roundtable Initiative. He wrote a paper on natural disasters as threats to peace when he was a senior fellow here last year. It may be indicative of what you will hear from Fred, that he has come to refer to himself as the Chicken Little of natural disasters and national security. Some of that came out a little bit in your moderation earlier, Fred. Each of them, we've asked each of them to speak for roughly 10 minutes, which should leave us roughly 35 to 40 minutes for questions and your questions and comments. I'd like to ask them to sort of take their comments in order, and we'll hold the questions until after each of them has spoken. We'll start with John.
Thank you, and I need to say at the outset that although my standing to be here and talk about this subject does undoubtedly derive from the National Academy Report, don't blame them for what I'm about to say. I'm taking liberty to sort of present my own views of the matter. So let me make just a series of comments that I personally derive from this experience. And first of all, that with assurance, we should know, and we should admit that we do know, that the process of global warming will assuredly generate extreme climate events with increasing frequency and severity over the next several decades. Although a lot about the details we cannot predict, we do know that that's going to happen. So we're looking at intensified instances of drought and flooding, increasing occurrence of violent storms, increasing occurrence of intense heat waves, and disruption of traditional agricultural product cycles, all of which have very substantial capacity to cause social disruption. It's prudent to expect that in some societies the consequences will be severe enough and internal adaptation inadequate enough to compel international response at a level that we do not have any precedent for. We're looking at problems and responses that have no prior precedent. The candidates for where this might occur, one of which has been mentioned, Pakistan, is my candidate for the most likely place for this to happen. Egypt is high on the list as well. These are places that that we do have to worry about in greater detail than we currently do. At the moment, monitoring arrangements are not adequate to support the preventive and emergency reaction efforts that we have to anticipate will occur. Just a few sort of figures on that. Only 40%, the IPCC has identified 50 essential climate variables that are important to gather information about to support the climate models. Roughly 25 of those are gathered by satellite, and of those, only 46% are collected, are robustly measured. 22% aren't measured at all, and the others are only sporadically and unreliably measured. Only 36% of the resulting data is adequately shared, and unless the data is shared, you cannot really utilize it to maximum advantage. And that's the story with regard to the climate variables. The interaction here that has been discussed, Helen Clark was very good about this, it's an interaction of climate and society going on here. And resilience is a big issue. That means you need to gather social variables as well and relate them to the climate variables. And the gathering and sharing of social variables is even more primitive than the state-of-the-art of gathering climate variables. In other words, we do not at the moment have a monitoring system worthy of the problem, although we do have the technology to create such a thing. We haven't done it yet. I conclude, obviously, that it's imperative to develop a monitoring system worthy of the problem. That involves setting data collection priorities. You cannot prioritize 50 variables. You have to reduce the list to a more essential one, both in terms of climate and social variables. Having done so, you have to deploy and maintain the sensors necessary to acquire the data. One has to assure global collaboration, and believe me, the problem of sharing relevant data is a big issue. A couple of vignettes. India will not share with the United States the ground monitoring systems for its river flows. So we are relying solely on satellites to understand precipitation in India. Pakistan classifies that data and won't share it with anybody. We've got to break through that and establish a much higher standard of global collaboration. There needs to be continuous management of the resulting database. You have to create a database, and then you have to manage it, and you need an institution to do that, all of which is yet to come. And then finally, in our panel, we were arguing, having done that, we need to develop stress test procedures for especially vulnerable locations, precisely because our ability to predict climate disaster is very limited. We have to see it emerging as it does occur. You need early warning indicators. I would say, in addition to that, then, it's also imperative to develop appropriate assistance for adaptation emergencies. Again, anticipating some societies, especially vulnerable places, are going to get into more trouble than they alone can handle. What does that mean? Well, at the moment, I would say very important to invest in affordable alternative power generation for both Pakistan and Egypt. They are encountering severe internal disruption, riots basically, associated with inadequate power generation in both places. I think we need global buffering stocks for essential agricultural commodities, because we do have to anticipate the probability of serious enough disruption of global markets to cause serious problems in some places. And then I would argue that we certainly need enhanced disease monitoring and expedited epidemiological reaction, because we should anticipate that the incidence and consequence of disease is going to be related to global warming. And that should compete with Fred in terms of Chicken Little as well.
Very good. Thank you, John. Sherry?
Great. Thank you very much, Proctor. And it's a pleasure to be here at USIP. It's an important institution with a very critical mission, and I've had the pleasure of working on a variety of projects with USIP. I served about 20 years ago now. I started as the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense, the first Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security. And at that time, many people asked, what do environment and security have to do with one another? Now, people don't ask that question so much today, and all of you gathered here are here because probably you're interested in this subject. Maybe you come at it from more of a development and humanitarian assistance standpoint than a national security standpoint, which is the field I've been working in. And I would say that what we are seeing now is an important convergence of the development, diplomacy, and defense fields. And let me, with respect to these non-traditional security threats. So let me say a little bit about that. I have been privileged to work for the last 5 to 6 years with a group of senior retired military leaders who we formed into a military advisory board at my think tank, CNA. We are the kind of home of military operations analysis for the Navy and Marine Corps. And using this military advisory board, we started back in 2006 and 2007 and looking at the national security implications of climate change. We concluded that climate change is a threat multiplier for instability in fragile regions of the world and will be disruptive even in stable regions. And we've seen the evidence mount since that time. We've seen the evidence of extreme weather, of drought, of floods, of sea level rise, of increased variability in weather patterns, and increased severity of storms. So now we are living in the new normal. And with that, we've seen also increasing food shortages, water scarcity and tensions around the world, the spread of disease, and many other, and competition over natural resources. And now we're faced with a world where these challenges are not ones, they are ones of development and they are ones of diplomacy, but they are increasingly ones also of national security. And so we've seen in the last 5 years, both the US and many countries around the world now begin to incorporate into their national security strategies the need to understand the implications of climate change, of energy security, of water security, and I think we'll see in the future even food as well as disease, which is probably already included, as becoming the mainstream security concerns. So I think this is the world. Many of you who are beginning your careers or in the middle of them embark on a world where there are opportunities to build this new culture that is not so siloed between those three, development, diplomacy, and defense, but ones where we recognize that the capacities that we need in each of those fields are beginning to converge. And we had a session here earlier this morning where we talked about how some of the tools and structures that have been built over in the post-Cold War period to deal with what we thought were the traditional security threats, the kinetic threats, the weapon systems, dismantling Cold War era weapon systems, or combating terrorism. Many of those are the same kinds of capacities we need to deal with these non-traditional threats. We've talked about how we use the phrase building partner capacity, and we've built structures for that within our defense community. But now, of course, we heard Helen Clark speak eloquently about how we need to build that partner capacity across the range of development needs that we face as a globe, as a planet. So I see the opportunities for us moving forward and recognizing the important data gaps that John Steinbrenner referred to, and the monitoring gaps in the report that we did, and the need to understand the stress, climate stress, natural resource stress, and how that is affecting security, particularly in key locations, key strategic locations, Pakistan and Egypt among them, and better to have the understanding of the key variables, what we need to monitor, and then how we take that data and evidence and how we make it available to policymakers to make better decisions, both preventive decisions, as Helen Clark was talking about, we need to invest in disaster risk reduction, as well as the humanitarian assistance. In the national security community and defense, you talk about doing humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, HADR. Back in the 90s, we actually also talked about having a preventive defense strategy. And one could see those concepts coming back now again in a new chapter. When Bill Perry was Secretary of Defense, we had the preventive defense strategy. We talked about building trust, cooperation, and civilian control of the military. Helen Clark used many of those same phrases. We need to build trust. We need to build cooperation and civil society and tolerance and strong networks and connections. And those are all the hallmarks of a resilient society. So I would say that is the world that we're hopefully moving forward as we see and become more aware of the increasing stress that natural resources and their depletion and their scarcity pose to our society.
Thank you, Proctor. Yeah, I wear the banner Chicken Little very proudly, actually, because I think Chicken Little, The Boy Who Cried Wolf, and Thomas Malthus were all just ahead of their time. I came here as a fellow a year and a half ago to work on the issues of natural disasters and national security without being steeped in those subjects. But my background was came out of national security. I worked years ago in the Foreign Relations Committee, and I've been a foreign policy junkie most of my life. Worked with John Steinbrenner in the old days on arms control. But what struck me in reading the literature on not just climate change, and I'll come back to that point, but the range of threats from our habitat is how little we are taking those threats to be from a national security point of view. Indeed, I think one of the problems in talking about these issues is the aversion that most people have, but certainly most Americans, who like to be thought of as being optimistic and problem solving, the resistance people have to coming to grips with the reality of what we're facing from this combination of challenges from our environment. Actually, the combination of what the environment is doing and the vulnerabilities that we have created as a human race. We put people in places that they are deeply in jeopardy to begin with, and the consequences of increasing environmental threats are to make those people even more vulnerable. So it's this aversion to gloom, frankly, that I think is interfering with our ability to come to grips with just the scope and depth of the problems that we're facing, even within the next 10 years. Now, I grew up, as I said, during the Cold War, and I never remember anybody ever saying, well, let's not imagine what the Soviets might do because that would be too depressing. I mean, we imagined every conceivable thing that the Russians, the Soviets in those days would do to us because we wanted to anticipate what the worst cases might be so that we could figure out how to avoid the worst cases, how to prepare for them. So it wasn't regarded as being an intellectually inappropriate exercise to try to look for what those worst cases might look like. And if you combine the range of demographic, scarcity, and climate issues from place to place, Pakistan being a good example, but there are many more, I think what we're facing is a level of crisis that we are not anticipating in order to prepare for the political fallout that will result. Now, some of this is a culture problem. Some of this is the fact that the way scientists like to approach issues like this is to get good data, have strong models, use hypotheses that can be tested and proven, and there's great reluctance to make predictions or talk about dangers that you can't have high confidence in talking about. But unfortunately, in the national security world, that's not usually the kind of environment that we're in. The data is not always robust, and the hypotheses relating to human beings are far more complicated in most cases than they are for natural systems. And so the challenge is judgment. It's innovative conceptual thinking about what might happen. It's putting things together in scenarios that can be very complicated, but nevertheless try to represent reality in a way that allows us to prepare for them. Because I think what I'm leading up to is the fact that we need to change our thinking to more conform with the way national security people talk, which is about metaphors and narratives and storylines that explain why threats should be taken more seriously, that aren't always supported by the most robust kinds of data, but that can be subjected to peer-reviewed discussion about the real realities that those scenarios represent. Mother Nature has become our worst enemy. That is not just a metaphor that I'm throwing out for fun. I believe, frankly, that in terms of our national security, the existential threats of the future, and I mean the short-term future, are going to come from the environment because we are not prepared to deal with the scale of what we're facing. And therefore, the political fallout itself will be part of the problem. The danger is that the stress created by environmental crises will cause us to turn on ourselves, both within societies and between societies. Just imagine if this pandemic that we've been talking about for 10 years now, a global pandemic that will start taking many, many lives on the order of potentially the Spanish flu of 1918. Supposing something like that would break out, can you imagine the political consequences in societies that don't have the medicine, looking at societies that do have the medicine? I think if nothing else, we need to begin to think about how we would prepare to promote solidarity in the face of such crises, rather than to allow ourselves on short notice to fall back on what is a more typical human response in a crisis, which is to narrow the scope of identity and to narrow the loyalties that emerge. And in crisis after crisis, I think that's the kind of speculation we need to engage in. Not because we think the worst case will happen, but because we want to avoid the even worse case. We're going to see some worst cases in terms of human impact within the next 10 years, in my opinion. What we want to avoid is what it could be even worse if we haven't thought through the political consequences and worked on building some institutions and forms of collaboration that prevent us from being divided among ourselves. Now, if that depresses you, I'm sorry. But, you know, I have a grandchild, and so I think of these things in very concrete terms. I was reminded, just listening this morning to some talk about doing scenario building, and I remember when my son first went to kindergarten, and I'm thinking to myself, all the horrible things that could happen to him when he gets in that door. The scissors, you know, is the paste poisonous? You know, is the teacher really going to have control of this class? Knowing my son, that was an important question. I even literally thought about knee pads, if you can believe me. It depends. Excuse me. It depends how much you care about something in terms of how you speculate about the dangers that they face. So I don't think I'm imagining the scenarios that I'm talking about here. I think we all need to begin to imagine them, not to depress ourselves, but to do what we need to do, which is to anticipate how bad it could be and prevent it from happening, becoming that bad. That's our challenge. Now, to some extent, the global warming debate in this country, and indeed many countries, has distracted our attention from the level of vulnerability that other factors are creating for us. Even if we didn't have, you know, the problem of climate volatility that, as Sherry said, becomes a threat multiplier in so many situations. The population growth alone in many countries creates problems and profiles that can't end well. Let me just use 3 examples. We talked about Pakistan. The population of Pakistan will go between 2010 and 2025 from 175 million people to 235 million people. The population of Nigeria is going to go from 158 million people to 258 million people. The population of Egypt is going from 85 million people to 110 million people. Now, at least half of those new people are going to be young men, and most of them have no prospect of employment. This is not going to be a pretty picture in those countries. And in part because if you lay on this environmental picture I'm painting, the fact that in place after place, our political capacity to manage complicated trade-offs that these issues present is simply not there. Governments across the spectrum are becoming less functional in deciding how to deal with major, massive problems like that take choices and investments that can be politically very sensitive. And it's really the politics on top of the problem that create the real challenge we have. We know in many cases what some solutions are that would at least reduce the prospect of the crises I'm talking about. But politically, we're very often unable to implement even the solutions that we know about. So, read my little gloomy paper or my gloomy little paper. But frankly, if I were writing it today, I would write it even more dramatically than that.
Great, great. Well, thank you, Fred. Thank you, Fred. We will take questions and comments from all of you. Please use the mics, but while you're assembling for those, this question of political will, there was an observation made this morning in discussing all of this after listening to the litany of challenges and trends and rather sort of frightening scenarios that, in fact, the solutions to these issues are technically within our grasp and that we're really talking about a problem of political will. I'm not sure I agree with that, but I would be interested in hearing your thoughts, your sort of reaction to that comment, whether that resonates, and to the issue of political will, I guess, how do you think you would tackle that problem or engage the public? Fred certainly posed one way. So John,
I basically agree with that. I find myself frequently saying the problem is not knowing that we don't know what to do, it's wanting to do it. And that refers to the ultimate issue of mitigation. What we know of the impulse, the thermal impulse associated with global warming is going to drive us eventually into transforming energy generation globally to contain it. Otherwise, as I think Helen Clark alluded to, we're not going to be able to tolerate a 6-degree average temperature rise. We aren't going to be able to tolerate that. And if that's what we're looking at, and it does looking at, ultimately we're going to have to transform global energy power generation on a pace that the market itself will not do. So that's my candidate for the #1 public policy problem globally. And what's required? Well, we're going to have to sort of finally absorb the danger. It eventually will come to us, but we'll also have to develop concepts of interest that are more comprehensive. I think Fred alluded to that. This is a situation in which you cannot narrow your identity and solve the problem. You're going to have to expand it. We're going to have to realize that to protect ourselves, we have to protect everyone, basically. And that, so you have to form inclusive coalitions, just to be, fairly specific about that. We are not going to be able to accomplish a criteria of mitigation that protects the operating conditions of human societies without a dramatic expansion of nuclear power generation. That's the only way we're going to be able to do it. We're not going to be able to expand on that basis with current reactor designs, current fuel cycle management practices, or current security relationships, all of which will have to change fundamentally in order to enable that to happen. In order to do that, we're going to have to realize we have powerful common interests here that require basically global coordinated action. Okay, we cannot afford a confrontation with China, Russia, India. We've got to bring these societies into intimate collaboration in order to accomplish that. That is not only political will, it's political conception. I don't have to tell you that inside the Beltway, these are not welcome comments. And people will pass them off as, well, that's impossible. It's not impossible, it's going to happen. The pace at which it happens is a major question, and what drives it. And I wish I could answer that question better than I can.
Sure. Sherry.
Well, one of the main findings of the National Academy's report, John and I and others did, was to expect surprises. And, you know, I am a glass half full person, as you could tell. So, you know, none of us expected 5 years ago that the U.S. would now be a powerhouse in shale oil and gas, and that we would have completely reversed our energy security situation to the point where we have dramatically begun to reduce our dependence on imports of fossil fuels, and we have also begun to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. Now, it's not without its own challenges, but we didn't expect that 5 years ago. So there's a lot we don't know what to expect also in the future. So we do have to prepare to be a more resilient society. We do have to take the steps to recognize the evidence of extreme weather, of the increases in disaster, of the fact that we are depleting our natural resources at a fairly alarming rate. I am hopeful, though, because I think that increasingly, even though it's not as fast a pace as many of us who are in this field would like, we are seeing there is evidence that more and more people understand this. Important leaders, the political will question, are recognizing it and taking action. So I want to just share with you comments made recently by the admiral who is in charge, the 4-star admiral in charge of our Pacific forces, the PACOM commander, Admiral Locklear. He says, significant upheaval related to the warming planet is probably the most likely thing that is going to happen that will cripple the security environment, probably more likely than other scenarios we often talk about. He says, we've interjected into our multilateral dialogue, even with China and India, the imperative to get the military capabilities aligned for when the effects of climate change start to impact these massive populations. If it goes bad, you could have hundreds of thousands or millions of people displaced, and then security will start to crumble pretty quickly. Okay, that's not an activist talking. That's the military leader, one of our top admirals in the U.S. military today, who's in charge of our Pacific forces, who sees it because he's out in the Pacific Islands. He's in Bangladesh. He's throughout the Asia-Pacific region, and he sees what it means, and he is making it a point as part of his leadership there, as part of our American leadership, to incorporate these critical concerns, and that gives me hope.
Terrific. All right. Now, are there questions from you? Yes. Would you please identify yourself? Thank you.
Yes, I'm Ann Cummings with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Preparedness and Response Division. Thank you all. This has been a great panel. But we have talked today almost exclusively about governmental and multilateral actions. And one of the things that has become a growing presence, certainly in disaster response, has been the role of the multinational corporation or business as a whole. And could you speak a little bit about that, both a multinational corporation's ability to shape the political environment in other countries and the role of extractive industries?
Do you want to take it, Fred?
Yeah, I spent most of my career actually in large corporations, AT&T, Cable and Wireless, Microsoft. And I wouldn't put a lot of hope on, largely because corporations don't have the ability to change the enabling environment, call it, for what needs to happen for populations to come to grips with what's going on. It really is a political challenge that requires, political will has been mentioned, it's political capacity to make decisions on tough issues that from country after country we're seeing governments unable to make. It's not that the private sector doesn't have a role in addressing these issues, and obviously the whole improved prospect for natural gas in this country is partly an innovation of the private sector. It wouldn't happen without investment and innovation of that kind, and that's a very positive step. Unfortunately, though, it doesn't really address the bigger issue, at least in terms of mitigation, to John's point about the carbon energy profile is just going to have to change if we're really going to prevent the longer-term consequences. It's already too late to prevent the impact that's going to occur in the next 10 years. All the carbon trading we might do, all the recycling we might do in the next 10 years is irrelevant in terms of what's already going to impact us. So, private investment and private strategies are important in evolving economies in the right direction, but governments are going to have to take a lead in making these political decisions because they're that big. It's just not going to happen otherwise.
I guess I have a slightly different take. Without really totally disagreeing with all of Fred's gloom, I'm going to give you the ways in which I am more hopeful about the public-private partnerships that can be affected. I do think that the private sector is very important in this space. And, we have traditionally, in the national security field, we've traditionally, for the last decade, used these public-private partnerships as a way to sort of outsource defense functions in war zones, okay? That model is going away, and it's migrating to one where I think we will be able to strategically leverage the capacities of the private sector and companies in particular situations. So if we identify more clearly and understand what the needs are for building resilience in a particular location, maybe we can harness an energy company, infrastructure. Ahmed, you work at HHS, the pharmaceutical industry, specific major companies with capacity to provide the needed services and products in that particular location to help build some of that resilience, because governments can't do it alone, but governments can be the catalyst, and we can find willing partners. So I think that model of the public-private partnership, and there's a growing literature on this field, is going to evolve to one where there's going to be more opportunity of a different type than we've seen in the last decade.
Let me just add one comment, though. I derived from a conversation I had this morning. Question, can the private sector invest in monitoring, global monitoring, and develop? And the answer is, so far, absolutely not. That's a public function. There have been attempts to induce private sector, and it doesn't work. So if we are going to monitor the environment, to give us the data we need to understand it, that's a public investment problem. The private sector, they may be contractors, but that's not going to be the source of the money.
Terrific. There was another question? No.
Good afternoon. My name is Felicia Gannett. I work with USAID, currently focusing on Sudan. My question is, I guess, geared towards Sherry. Thank you all for your comments. You mentioned non-traditional security threats and national security. Unfortunately, in this day and time, national security is now international security. And I want to know from you, when do you think will be the time when donor countries and governments stop being reactionary to things that are happening in the world today? For example, in northern Nigeria, if you guys are aware of what's going on with Boko Haram, if you look at that case, Boko Haram started in Maiduguri, which is around on the border of Lake Chad, which has been drying up for the last several years now, and there's been loss of livelihood. And I don't know when people are going to start realizing that these environmental changes and the loss of livelihood are contributing to characters like Boko Haram. Instead of being reactionary when the situation, becomes terrorism, and now you have this buzz term, why aren't we addressing the root causes of these cases from the beginning? There's several. This is you can double fold this, over to other things that have happened here in the U.S. I mean, the situation in Mali, I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Gao. I mean, now look at northern Mali.
Well, you make a very good point. And 20 years ago, we were looking at images of Lake Chad and we were looking at Lake Baikal, and there were those in the U.S. government who, you know, we knew what the environmental stress was occurring, you know, it was hard. It was even harder then to mobilize awareness and action than it is today. But you make a good point. You know, human behavior. First of all, we all know that governments and institutions tend to respond to a crisis, and nobody does enough to act preventively in most fields. I mean, we know there's been some recent work that's been in the news this week about behavioral economics, you know, by Cass Sunstein, about how humans just tend to procrastinate and they tend to be overly optimistic, although Fred, I think, is the good exception to that rule. But maybe I'm, you know, in the mainstream. But, you know, that's human nature. But it also, that optimism in part provides the resilience to withstand it. I was, you know, listening to Helen Clark. Now I'll tell that personal story I was going to tell, but she left. So I was thrilled to be here with her, partly because she's from New Zealand. And I have family in New Zealand. So how is that? Well, my parents are Holocaust survivors. They were fortunate enough to be able to come to this country, and some of my family escaped to New Zealand because there were people willing to help them out in the 1930s. So, you know, I come from a family that knew from conflict, violence, and disaster, you know, of a different type in a different era. And now we're confronted with that in our own time. So, you know, you know, and you faced it, obviously, you've been involved in it in places where it's very real today and where we obviously are not doing enough. But that's why we're all here in the room doing what we're doing today, because we're committed to try to make improvements where we can. And I think the awareness of these non-traditional threats throughout both the security, development, and diplomacy community, and then using these new tools available as increased monitoring, understanding how to do stress tests, harnessing public-private partnerships in a whole-of-government comprehensive approach. It's not going to solve all the problems, but hopefully we'll do a better job going forward.
Let me make one comment about that. Part of the answer is that we need to have acknowledged reason to care to upgrade the level of effort that we make. And at the moment, it's inadequately developed. And I pose to my students the question all the time, is that because we're not seeing something that's there, or because there really isn't a reason to care, and we have to acknowledge that? My answer is there is a reason to care, that it's powerful enough to support a higher level of effort that is underdeveloped in this country in particular. And that reason is that the entire rule of law is up for grabs here in all of these situations. And we are not going to run a global economy without establishing a robust rule of law. And there isn't going to be any government that does it. You cannot sort of, thank God we don't have a Senate that tries to act for the world as a whole. The rule of law is going to depend upon principles of equity established and defended, and there is an open question as to what the trend is. Are the criminals going to win, or are the legitimate, if you will, enterprises going to win? And we have a huge stake at that. That concept is inadequately developed in this society and in all other societies, and until it does get better developed, we're going to be making inadequate efforts in places like the ones you mentioned.
Quick follow-up, yeah.
I would think that September 11th would have been a reason to care, because people like that are being recruited into these organizations.
Yeah, but it requires some conceptualization of exactly how and why should we care. And I think it's fair to say we've had a fairly hysterical and fairly narrow reaction to September 11th, and we need to have broader concepts.
Other questions? To build on that, I wanted to ask, you called out two case examples that you used in the report for Pakistan and Bangladesh, I believe, right? Were those the two that, not Egypt, excuse me, Pakistan and Egypt. But in this, your question sort of raises this is huge. I mean, we can't go after everything at once. So can you say a bit more about the prioritization or what are the criteria what did you think about in the course of this study that would help with this setting priorities and how we might proceed?
Let me admit that the focus on Pakistan is I sharpened it as compared with what the report understand there were 14 people on the committee and there were 11 reviewers, all of whom had to agree, right? That group of people would not collectively endorse the comment that Pakistan is the #1 problem. It was an illustration. But I'm suggesting there's a good reason to believe that it is, or it is a very good candidate for that. And the reason is that Pakistan is experiencing one of the most consequential climate-induced impacts at the moment, and that is a reduction in something like 30% in the Indus River water flow. And they were extraordinarily dependent upon that. And when you work out the details of this, they're facing very severe allocation problems associated with that, and they're mishandling the problems, and they're generating daily, almost daily, certainly weekly, protest riots, very violent as a consequence of that. So what we see is a situation in which a government unable to handle the allocational problems that are being thrown, and an underlying society in incipient stages of revolt in a place where you don't have to tell that Pakistan's an important place. And we are not seeing the situation. If you did see the situation, what would you do? That's not easy, but one of the things you would do is you would want a broader coalition dealing with Pakistan than just the US. You would want everybody around. And you would want everybody around very intensely engaged and very constructively engaged. These are not unimaginable. If you could get to people to agree about that, it's not too hard to figure out some of what could be done that would make a big difference. But we do not have the concept of danger or the instinct for how to reaction to it in place. And in some places like that, we're going to have to learn. I'm afraid, now my candidates are those two societies. Egypt and Pakistan are prone to internal violence on an order that we have not yet seen, and we're not going to be as able to ignore as we did in Africa, as we do in the Congo at the moment. We can't get away from those two places. So that'll be a learning experience for us, but we've got a long way to do conceptually to see the situation and see our interest in the reaction and the implications, which is we're going to have to combine actions in broader coalitions than we're currently doing.
Great. Sure. I didn't know whether you had any thoughts on prioritization. I mean, if there are anything you would add to that?
Well, they're both strategically important. Pakistan, of course, is nuclear armed. If those two countries become even more internally even more unstable than they are today, they pose risk to the whole region and threaten American security, U.S. national security and international security. So, we do care deeply about their stability in the region and their future success as a society. And they do have, as John said, both these underlying conditions of water stress and extreme events, sea level rise in Egypt, flooding and drought and mismanagement of water and competition over water in Pakistan, that make both situations very complicated, complex, and ones of importance to the United States and to others.
And I would add short-term intense population growth in both cases.
Yeah, good point.
If they're already stressed for food and water, think what these additions of people.
And if you're looking at instances where a major society could come unglued in a way that we cannot ignore, and have to react to. These two are very good candidates for that. And we are not remotely prepared to do that at the moment. We aren't conceptually prepared. We've got all the wrong instincts as to how to go about it.
Very good. The question here, please.
Dawn Calavia from Refugees International. You've been talking a lot about, or at least Helen Clark did, disaster risk reduction, disaster mitigation. I heard one thing mentioned, obviously changing to a nuclear power status. Does anybody know how much money the world is spending right now on disaster risk reduction, disaster mitigation? I would bet it's less than one battleship.
I know the percentages.
What's the percentage?
Because we were,
What was
our
was
UNDP colleague.
3% of the total international.
Well, 3% of the total
International aid.
global aid budget goes for humanitarian, or goes for disaster assistance. 70% of that.
Risk reduction.
1%, he said, actually. 70% of that 1% goes for humanitarian, for disaster relief, humanitarian disaster relief. And 27% of that 1% goes for recovery operations.
Right. And
disaster risk reduction is what's left. So it's a minuscule amount of investment in resilience, basically.
The answer is we're massively underinvested, given our interests, massively. Posing the question, do we have a society that is able to reallocate assets under these conditions? And that is an important question.
Can I have a follow-up? Do we have a model that suggests what the payout is for disaster risk reduction, disaster mitigation? I mean, it's very important if we're going to use the security context that we have models and that we can talk about them and say, this is a 1% investment for a 10% return. I haven't seen a lot of that. I'm sure there must be some.
Well, again, this colleague this morning said that it's either 1 to 4 or 1 to 7, but in some cases, examples, they've calculated it's 1 to 40. And that's usually where you get a complex conflict, natural disaster impact for failing to invest in resilient infrastructure and other kind of institutional strength.
And the answer is we have models, but they cannot carry the burden of proof being currently imposed upon them. And in much of what we're talking about, the critical question is, who carries the burden of proof? You have to demonstrate that the problem is severe enough to justify investment, or do you have to demonstrate the opposite, that it is safe enough that we can ignore it? At the moment, it's pretty obvious. The burden of proof falls on anyone who wants to say that global warming is serious enough that we have to invest in mitigating it or in adaptation. The burden of proof falls on the people issuing warning. At some point, that may shift, and it's hard to tell where close we are. But basically, unfortunately, whoever carries the burden of proof loses, given the complexity of the issue.
Terrific. Another question here.
Good afternoon, Elizabeth Evans, Department of State. My question's for all of you, but specifically Sherry, regarding the military, you spoke about efforts in Asia and the Pacific through PACOM, and sort of this being a place of hope in terms of taking responsibility and monitoring and prevention for climate change concerns. Can you expand on what's happening there and what you think the future of possible military collaboration relating to monitoring and crisis response to climate issues in the South Pacific?
Okay, well, 2 years ago, I participated with Admiral Locklear's predecessor, Admiral Willard, held a conference on energy, water, and disaster risk reduction in the Asia-Pacific region. And he gathered together representatives from the ASEAN countries to begin to look very specifically at what the challenges are, and then how through PACOM they can begin to build capacity. Now, when you're talking about doing this through military organizations, and I did when I was in DOD 15, 20 years ago, I held conferences with them to help PACOM commander, and what we were trying to build was environmental partnerships across each of the combatant command regions. And we did that at the time. I was interested in advancing the capacity of the military to address environmental safety and health considerations. And sometimes that view was shared among military leaders. But sometimes it was seen as, well, okay, here are some non-threatening tools we can use to have a dialogue with another country. So we can, we can talk to the Chinese about how to deal with common environmental or energy problems, but we can't talk with the PLA about, our weapons acquisition strategy. So sometimes these are methods of having a dialogue in a non-threatening form. Way to sort of advance cooperation and build trust. Sometimes they're about the actual issue, and they're also about building capacity to work in those actual issues. Now, today, I'd say this is very closely related to sort of what building capacity to respond to humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, search and rescue capacities. These are all kinds of capabilities that militaries need to exercise with them among themselves. They need to be able to work together in responding to disasters. And then also they work with other related agencies. So you'll see Coast Guards and Homeland Security type agencies, as well as health, environment, energy. I'm sure I've left some out here, but and then you see an increasing public-private partnership bringing together NGOs, as well as the private sector, and doing some of that in the military has these annual exercises they conduct. Partly the ability to build resilience either in a society or an institution depends on what your starting capacity is. So if you think of the difference, and Helen Clark alluded to this in her remarks, between the way between how New Zealand was affected by the earthquake and Haiti, a couple of years ago, obviously there was much less loss of life in New Zealand than there was in Haiti. I mean, we all know the reasons why, right? Because the society overall is more resilient. The building codes are better. The safety standards are better. You could tick down a whole list of reasons why, and we know that. We don't know how to fix where we have a deficit yet, but we all know intuitively why, and we can see the evidence. In government institutions, the military has had the ability, it's shrinking with the defense budget, but to have some capacity to do annual exercises. So you can use those exercises to help build capacity in peacetime, and that's and using it to build capacity in this area is increasingly important, and I see the recognition of that in PACOM and in other commanders as well.
Just a brief comment. The United States does not invest in operating capability for anybody but the military. It's the only institution in our society that's given standby operating capability you're not immediately using. And as a result, the military acquires responsibility for whatever requires operating capability on short notice. In principle, we ought to make broader investments in operating capability in response to disaster relief, et cetera. But again, that's a conceptual problem we haven't solved internally.
Yeah, the military in PACOM, they're building cyclone shelters in Bangladesh.
And why? Because they are the only ones who can do that sort of thing.
And they also know that they'll be called on to help the Bangladeshis when something really bad goes.
Global 911 force.
Sure, I mean, it's all for the right reasons. But one of the reasons that I'm an optimist, believe it or not, is that I think these issues, if we view them properly, give reasons for solidarity, for common interest across countries as well as within societies for dealing with the same challenges. They shouldn't be divisive issues, but the danger is that we won't anticipate them in time to make sure that they don't become divisive, because it takes preparedness to be able to have the expectations properly set that people are going to work together in crisis. The way in this country people usually do when we have a natural disaster in this country. But the scale of what we're facing creates a whole new dynamic that I think we need to think through a lot harder.
Question here?
Hi, Russell Mall. That was loud. Sorry about that. Russell Mall with DevEx. I was just wondering, in the development community, the buzz right now with USAID Forward, building resilience by putting responsibility and ownership in the populations. Given the National Intelligence Council, all their reports, like global trends, they recognize all the issues that we're discussing here. I know the DoD is a buzz with all these issues of climate change and how it's going to affect security in the future. And I was wondering, given the topic of climate change, if that is going to be a point of convergence for all of them, or some galvanizing feature that's going to bring them together to tackle these problems in the future. And I was wondering if you could comment on that.
You're really an optimist. You know, I think you see it happening in the remarks I just read to you by Admiral Locklear. I mean, I think in certain places where you see it's actually affecting the operating forces today and affecting what today's missions are, which is true right now in the Asia Pacific, you see that. I don't think you're going to see the CENTCOM commander having that same concern. He's still, you know, focused on how does he draw down in Afghanistan and the other conflicts in the region. So I think where you see it right up close as today's threat, yeah. And I do think that there's, you know, some of it's generational change, some of it's it's today's mission. And you know what we've seen in our military is it's been a force of you know, it's been an institution that reflects the direction of society, you know, from racial integration to you know, other integrations that we've seen in our own time. So I think as you see the uptake of these changing concepts in an institution like the military, it's a reflection back on where our own society is going. Sometimes it takes a while to catch up, and the progress is uneven. But there is a great capacity, you know, to lead forward and to bring with it the development and diplomacy communities in a constructive way. I agree with John's point that, you know, we've only vested in the military the standby operating capacity. There's great desire within parts of the diplomatic and even development community to be operational in some sense, to be able to be expeditionary, so that when called on in a natural disaster or humanitarian relief situation, it's not only the military that can go on 24 hours notice. And we witnessed the problems of that in the last decade in Iraq and Afghanistan, where we had needs for the development and diplomatic community to be as expeditionary as the military could, and that wasn't always possible. So, you know, if we're smart, we'll try to vest those capabilities more in our civilian institutions as well. But we shouldn't make any mistake that also requires resources, and we are living at a time when our government resources are increasingly limited.
Just a small comment. The United States military is extremely good at engaging with people when they're told to do so. So I would just say that we need to tell PACOM in particular, actually, rather than preparing to fight the Chinese, get engaged with them so we don't have to do that. They're very good at doing that. The real accomplishment of the U.S. military is the dynamics within our alliances, because and so we have to extend their range, if you will, in practicing that art. And I think PACOM in particular is leaning forward on that. They don't want to fight the Chinese. They want to engage with them. They need to be told to do so. And we're not giving them that message at the moment.
That's very, very encouraging.
Can I just make
Other questions here? Did you want to make a?
That's right.
So hold on.
My name's Tom Navratil, and I'm with the State Department. I have a follow-up question to something John said earlier about the need for a massive increase in nuclear energy as a source of electricity to deal with and mitigate climate change. And I'd be interested in your thoughts on the use of thorium as opposed to uranium. And the advocates claim that it's got much lower problems in terms of safety, weapons proliferation, and storage of waste.
Yeah, that's a possibility, it's a distinct possibility. If you're going to have reactors that are passively safe, they don't explode, they just shut down. And proliferation resistance mean they are sealed fuel designs, so that the users don't have any reason or ability to get at the internal fuel. That's the key to this, and there are a number of paper designs that have those features, but none of them are immediately available. They all have to be brought through the famous Valley of Death to the point where operational prototypes could in fact be purchased and made. And the scheme is, imagine two competing global consortia making these in central locations, sending them out, having them sort of serviced for 20 years plus, and then bringing them back. And actually, the numbers work out very comparable to what sort of wide-body aircraft are at the moment. And we've got 2 producers of those. That's the concept, okay? And there are a number of potential designs, but none of them yet have those 2 features in common, that they're passively safe, and that they have sealed fuel features, so and it can be made, if you will, in a manufacturing location. And we need to have a runoff on those designs to develop, say, 4 or 5 of them to the point of, or 3 maybe, to the point of, whether a fluorium design would make it through the competition, I don't know, but maybe, actually. Because I think that if you're controlling the fuel to the degree that that concept implies, then you're less concerned about exactly what the fuel is, because you've got a much higher, stronger hold over the proliferation dangers associated with it. That concept needs development. It screamingly needs development. It'll take quite a while, actually.
Very good. No further questions?
We've answered all the
Well, you've answered all the questions. No, I did want to give you each an opportunity if you had a question for each other or a closing remark, and we're not slaves to the clock. We can wrap it up here. So, anything you'd like to add? Is there anything that we forgot to mention?
Well, I'll continue on my theme of gloom and doom.
Oh, we were ending on a positive note.
No, we talked about political will, and the point I'm trying to make is that we want to generate the political will to address these resilience issues and these preparedness issues by doing scenarios that show us how bad things could get, because we want to avoid them. My fear is that we won't do that, and we're going to have to suffer a whole series of impacts, disasters, that will then galvanize the political will. I wish we didn't have to pay that price to get there, but I suspect that's likelihood. We may look back at Hurricane Sandy as we look back on the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center. It should have been a wake-up call, but it wasn't until something worse happened that we really began to take that challenge seriously. Sandy was, after all, just a Category 1 hurricane. And being from New Jersey, it breaks my heart what happened to the Jersey Shore, but it's really just been a matter of time before that kind of storm did that kind of damage to those vulnerable locations. And those are going to happen more and more unless we take seriously the kind of vulnerabilities we've created for ourselves.
That's truly a fundamental question. Do we have a political system that can anticipate and prevent rather than react? And so far, the answer would be we haven't done very well in that regard.
Right. But is it fair to say, I think you have called for in this report for increased capacity of monitoring and modeling at a regional level. We've done climate models at a global scale, so developing the tools, the data, the information that would help inform.
And one of the reasons for doing that is to make us pay attention. If you have the information, if it's coming in, you analyze it, you see the situation, that generates reaction.
Right.
But I don't have to tell you that those people who don't accept the problem and don't want anyone else to accept the problem are not eager to have the data. So there's a political fight that has to be won to get the monitoring in place. But that probably is a key to it. If we start looking systematically and seeing what the data is indicating, we will start to react because it's going to stare us in the face. And that's probably the best hope we have, Fred, of trying to get in front of it rather than having to wait for some disaster. So a lot rides on developing a monitoring system. Terrific.
Well, will you join me in thanking our panelists? Thank you for your observations. And on behalf of the U.S. Institute of Peace and the National Academies, I want to thank you all for coming today. So, thank you.